The last time we were together, we studied Daniel chapter 5. Now, that story, as we came to the conclusion, was a heartbreaking story. King Belshazzar had not learned the lessons of humility that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had learned many years before and had presumably passed down. He had learned those lessons the hard way. All Daniel can do when the king finally calls for him to come to help is to give pronouncement of God's judgment that was so soon to come upon Babylon and everyone who lived there. Belshazzar, as the leader, had gone too far. God could not help him anymore because he would not listen. The last verses we read in Daniel chapter 5 stated these somber words in verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. If you turn with me in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel 6 picks up right at the beginning of King Darius' reign. The first big thing he does, according to Daniel, is to restructure the leadership structure in the kingdom of Medo-Persia. He's taking over Babylon and making it into a Medo-Persian kingdom. He appoints 120 leaders to oversee the government. Those 120 men report to 3 men who are kind of the administrators of the whole group. Daniel was chosen as one of those 3 leaders to answer directly to the king. It seems a bit strange that someone who had just been named, the night of the conquering of Babylon, had just been named the second in command, or the second to the throne. There was third in command, but to the 2 kings, the second in command to the 2 kings that were on the throne. He chose this man, Daniel, in the new kingdom, in the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Darius chose him to be in the same kind of position of the 3 people that are administrators directly under the king. This is the 4th king in the 2nd kingdom that Daniel has served under. He was an incredibly wise leader. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, we'll pick up the story. Daniel distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The apparent favoritism of the king to Daniel did not go unnoticed by Daniel's peers and subordinates. This king did not notice Daniel because he was striving to get into a higher place. He wasn't pushing for a promotion. He wasn't trying to climb the ladder, so to speak. Everyone else was probably fighting for a higher position, but Daniel, it says, the thing that distinguished him was that he had an extraordinary spirit. He was humble. Perhaps King Darius had never seen anybody that was like this, that wasn't striving for higher position. So he wanted to put Daniel in charge of everybody, but some of the people under him did not like the idea of Daniel being put in charge of them and everybody else that were the leaders there in the Medo-Persian Empire. In verse 4, Daniel chapter 6, the administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." Now, the leaders who opposed Daniel tried desperately to try to find something that they could take Daniel down, that would disqualify him from his role in the kingdom. They combed through every detail of his life, looking for something that they could use against him, just a little bit of dirt, a little bit of mud that they could dirty his name so that he wouldn't be the person of influence that he was becoming in that kingdom. But they couldn't find a single thing wrong in the character of Daniel or in anything that he did. Daniel was blameless in every area of his private and public life. Everything that they tried to look at, they could find nothing wrong that he had done. He was honest. He was dependable. He did his job well. For Daniel, integrity was not just about looking good on the outside. Integrity for him was a strong commitment to godly principles that did not change depending on who was watching or what was at stake. He didn't act differently depending on what the situation was or who was around him. He was faithfully consistent, and he was consistently faithful. Daniel's life shows us that True integrity is not just about avoiding trouble just because somebody might see him do something wrong, but it's about being faithful to God's ways no matter what, no matter what's at stake. His faith affected every decision he made, every conversation he had, every act he did. In other words, his enemies concluded, we can't get him in trouble for doing anything wrong, so let's see if we can get him in trouble, if we can create a way to get him in trouble because he's too faithful to his God. Imagine having people realize that your worst flaw is that you are too faithful to your God, that you're more faithful to your God than anyone or anything else. His enemies came up with a scheme that they hoped would trap him. They knew he was faithful in worshiping God, but would he still have the courage to kneel if his life was on the line? They hoped so. Verse 6. So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever! All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and the Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." So King Darius signed the written edict. Darius was flattered that all his counselors wanted to honor him in this way. It didn't even cross his mind that Daniel could not have been on that list. All the administrators had not signed off on it, and it would likely get him in trouble. He knew Daniel well enough. The officials knew how committed and faithful Daniel was in worshiping God. The king did too, but it didn't cross his mind what they were trying to do to him. The officials expected Daniel to continue doing the things he had done, so they rushed to see what he would do after he found out about this decree. Verse 10, when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The window in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God just as he had done before. Daniel's courage to kneel before his God was not something new. He hadn't just started doing this because he was terrified of a crisis that was coming over him. This was something that he had always done. It was a habit that he had made. He wasn't shaken by threats or a fear of what might happen to him. This was something that was a surprise to him, but he wasn't terrified for some reason. Let me ask you this. If a situation like Daniel faced, if you were in a place where staying faithful could mean that you would be terribly injured or die, would your first instinct be to publicly give thanks to God? I'll be honest, I don't know if I'd be in that group. I hope I would be. I pray that I would be. Daniel had other options, didn't he? Couldn't he have just kept those windows closed? It was only for 30 days. He would still be worshiping God. He would still be faithful to God. He just wouldn't be sitting there at the window. He wouldn't be kneeling there at the window in view of everybody else. He could have kneeled quietly out of sight just to avoid trouble, but he didn't. This was his habit. He refused to act like he had turned his back on God, even for a moment. You know, this was not about putting on a show or even making a point. This was something that he was consistent in doing, and stopping that action of kneeling at his window and the upstairs window would be a sign that he was turning his back on God. His faith was so steady and such an important part of his life, this prayer 3 times a day, he could not imagine changing that practice even if his life was on the line. He loved his God too much. Daniel was fully willing to obey the king. He respected authority. He fulfilled every duty to the letter, everything that was asked from him, as long as it did not go against something that God had asked him to do, or something in his relationship or faith in God. He knew where his loyalty lay, and nothing, not even the death sentence, could make him compromise that loyalty. The spies eagerly reported Daniel's actions to Darius, reminded him of the law that could not be changed, and Darius suddenly realized what these crazy guys were trying to do. Vicious guys were trying to do to Daniel. He had been tricked and lied to. But he was also bound by this law that could not be changed. Not even the king himself could change a law that he had written. He desperately tried to figure out a way to save Daniel all the way up until sundown, as long as he had a chance to try to do something. He couldn't figure out a way to get Daniel to save his most trusted advisor, Daniel. Apparently, King Darius knew that the extraordinary spirit that he referred to Daniel having earlier, that extraordinary spirit was only because of his faithfulness to his God. And I'm sure Daniel had had many opportunities to witness to him, because when you read what he said when Daniel was about to be thrown into the den of lions, he respected Daniel's dedication to serve his God. It was clear. This is what the king told Daniel as he was thrown into that den of hungry lions. In verse 16, so the king gave the order. They brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." A stone was brought. That den of lions was sealed. Daniel inside. His fate seemingly also sealed. Nobody could survive that. The king had a little bit of hope, but how could you survive something like that? The king was unable to eat or sleep because he was so distressed over what he had been tricked into doing for his most trusted advisor. This is the reaction of somebody who had lost a close friend. His friend Daniel. Early the next morning, the king rushed to the sealed entrance. As soon as that night had passed, he rushed to the entrance of the lion's den. In verse 20, when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. "Daniel, servant of the living God," the king said, "has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" I can imagine a little bit of silence as he eagerly waits. Is he gonna hear this response coming back from this den of lions? Surely there's got to be a way. Then Daniel spoke to the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm." The men who falsely accused Daniel after Daniel was released from that lion's den, all of the men and the families that had falsely accused Daniel and tricked the king, were thrown into the lion's den, and they died that day because of what they had done. After this, King Darius wrote a decree in praise to the God of Daniel for all that the God of Daniel had done that day. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, "May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. God didn't stop Daniel's enemies from throwing him into that lion's den. He could have, but he didn't. He let wicked people do what they did up to a point. The reason why he did this was to make Daniel's rescue even so much more amazing, to completely defeat the enemies of truth, to completely defeat the enemies of righteousness that day. Sometimes we forget that God is able to take the things that Satan tries to do, that Satan seems to be accomplishing, and somehow accomplish something incredibly good at the other end of it. Daniel was a man of integrity. Where did this integrity come from? The number one key to developing real integrity is the consistency in your relationship with God. From the very first time we see Daniel in Babylon, in Daniel chapter 1, we watch him determine that he will not be defiled by the pagan king's lifestyle. And we see then how that integrity is rewarded. Integrity does not happen overnight. It's not something that just pops up. It is something that is built over time as you consistently connect with God. It's something that as you allow him to change your character and your values, integrity develops. When you spend regular, intentional time with God through prayer, study of his word, through listening to his guidance, his principles become a part of you, an integral part of you. This habit shapes how you think, how you speak, how you act, because your commitment to God is evident in everything you do, everything you say. This consistency creates a foundation so that when pressures push around you, when there is so much, where there is sometimes terror or there is something terrible that happens to you, when those pressures of trial come down on you, you react out of a place of faith rather than a place of fear and oftentimes compromise. Daniel's commitment to daily prayer was not just a routine. It was an essential part of his relationship with God. Living in a foreign land with constant pressures to become more like that culture and to adopt the values of that foreign country that he was in, Daniel's time with God became his lifeline. He prayed 3 times a day with his window open toward Jerusalem, a reminder of God's promises and his connection to his faithfulness to his people. This habit of devotion was much more than a ritual. It was a relationship with a God he loved and honored more than everything and everyone else. If your time with God just becomes another thing on your to-do list, something you just check off, oh, I'm done with that, you're missing the depth of what God intends. Like Daniel, you should approach your connection with God not as a routine, but intentionally growing your relationship with someone whom you long to become more like. When you consistently turn to God, it trains you to rely on him throughout the day. Through whatever you go through, by keeping your focus on God, you become more aware of his presence and his faithfulness. Even in a world that rejects most, if not everything that has to do with God. Daniel didn't start praying because the decree against praying to anything other than the king came out. That was not why he started praying. He prayed because it was already one of the most important times of his day. When a daily habit of turning to God is in place for everything in your life, good or bad, it prepares you for the challenges that come your way. In times of trial, you're prepared to respond in faith rather than in fear because your heart is already set on him. This is my appeal to you this morning. Will you make your relationship with God a habit? Starting today, if you haven't already. Doesn't have to start big. It can start small. It needs to start small. But will you make it a habit of every day, throughout the day, having your foundation focused on turning to God no matter what comes across your path? Will you allow God to give you a solid foundation so that when trials come, your natural response, your automatic response is faith in God? God's going to get me through this, and true faith, not just saying that, but true faith in who he is and what he has done for you in the past, rather than fear and possible compromise to try to be more comfortable throughout that trial. The experience of Daniel can be the experience of every single one of you today.